Now that we have a general idea of how we can build Xamarin applications and that we know the applications that we're going to be building, let's start by talking about what we need to actually start building the applications. So during this video, let's talk requirements. First, let's take a look at what you can do if you have a Mac computer and what you can do if you have a Windows computer. Let's start with Xamarin iOS, which is the classic part of Xamarin that is oriented to iOS specifically. If you have a Mac computer, you're good to go. You can start building Xamarin iOS applications. But if you have a Windows computer, you will actually need a Mac computer connected to the same network so the compiling, designing, and debugging can actually be performed. This is because these three things, the designing, the compiling, and the debugging, actually happened on the Mac. You can see it happening from Visual Studio on Windows and actually run the application on Windows, but behind the scenes, everything is actually happening on a Mac computer. So if you have only a Windows computer, you won't be able to target Xamarin iOS in the best way possible, but don't worry, we're going to talk about some other options that you will have, and we will present to you some alternatives so you can actually build iOS applications from Windows. In the case of Xamarin Android, whether you have Mac or you have Windows, it's just going to be seamless. You can start building Xamarin Android applications. And in the case of Forms, if you have a Mac computer, you will be able to build for iOS and for Android. In the case of Windows, you can actually also build for Windows in addition to Android and iOS. But again, for iOS, you will have to have a Mac computer connected to the same network. Now, in the case of that Mac computer, not all Mac computers will be able to run the latest tools. So if you really want to take advantage of Xamarin, you would want to have Mac OS Sierra installed, but if you have OS X El Capitan, which is 10.11, that should be enough. You will also need the latest iOS SDK installed on that Mac computer, which can be actually installed through Xcode. We will be going through the entire process in the next section. This is just something that you need to have installed on my computer before actually installing Xamarin. Everything else needed to start Xamarin development will be installed through the Xamarin installer. In the case of Windows, you will need Windows 8.1 or higher installed. You can actually develop Xamarin applications, Xamarin Classic applications with Windows 7, but for Xamarin Forms applications, you're going to be needing Windows 8.1. Like we mentioned before, you will need a Mac computer connected to a network. And that Mac will have to have El Capitan or preferably Mac OS Sierra installed, as well as the latest iOS SDK, which again is installed through Xcode. And just like on Mac, everything else needed will be installed through the Xamarin installer. Now let's talk a little bit about what you can do for developing iOS apps if you have no Mac available. One of the first alternatives and the newest alternatives is using Xamarin Live Player. Xamarin Live Player is this new tool that was released very recently that actually allows you to run your application directly on your Android or iOS device, physical device that you have with you without the use of cables. This means that you can actually run your iOS application from Visual Studio on a Windows PC into your iOS device. So if you have an iPhone or an iPod Touch or an iPad, you will actually be able to run your iOS applications without needing a Mac to be connected. This is great, but currently Xamarin Live Player is in beta, it's still in preview. And because of this, it doesn't have all of the features that we may be expecting. For example, it doesn't work with all projects. There are some kind of projects that just won't work with Xamarin Live Player. And it requires beta software to be installed. We are going to be covering the use of Xamarin Live Player in this course, so you will be able to build some iOS applications and test them on real devices without the need of a Mac, but a Mac is still very important for you to have. So here are some alternatives that you can consider when it comes to developing iOS applications and you don't own a Mac. One thing is for you to contact a friend who actually has a Mac, so he or she can lend that Mac to you for a couple of hours, maybe once or twice a week. You can also contact your school. Maybe in your school, in your university, there are some Macs that you can use as a student. That can be a great alternative as well. If none of this is available to you, you can actually rent a Mac in the cloud. There's this website that allows you to rent a Mac that you will actually be able to connect to Visual Studio on a Windows PC so you can test your iOS applications. Now, all of these alternatives will probably only get you very limited time of Mac usage because, well, your friend may need the Mac, the school may only lend you the Mac for a number of hours, and with Mac in Cloud, which is the website that allows you to rent a Mac in the cloud, well, you have to pay for the time that you use. But please, by no means does any of this means that you have to give up on developing iOS applications. Remember that the beauty of Xamarin is that you share most of the code. So you can actually start building that application and only testing on Android, and then whenever you have access to a Mac, actually test on a Mac. But you will know that that code actually already works because you have tested it before on Android. All you have to do is adapt it a bit onto your iOS application. And with Windows Forms, it's even better because it's not only the logic that you have already tested on Android, but also the UI. It will of course look different, but mainly it is the exact same UI, and if it works on Android, most of the times it's going to work on iOS. So really, with access to a Mac for only a couple of hours a week, if you are already developing your application, sharing a lot of code and testing it on Android, you should be able to create a very good iOS application as well, without you having to own a Mac. Now that we have talked requirements and what is the minimum setup that you need to build iOS and Android applications using Xamarin, in the next video, let's actually start by getting our setup ready and installing Xcode on Mac OS.